Let me ask you something. What if I told you that in 1890, something ancient and hungry awakened beneath the streets of San Francisco? Something that turned the city by the bay into a feeding ground? Something that couldn't be stopped, couldn't be reasoned with, and left dozens dead in the most excruciating way imaginable? This isn't fiction. Well, maybe it is. But after you hear this story, you might wonder if the history books left something out. So dim the lights, settle in, and whatever you do, if you hear humming in your walls tonight, don't investigate. Before we descend into the darkness of 1890 San Francisco, hit that subscribe button if you dare to journey into history's most terrifying tales. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing there are fellow horror lovers from every corner of the globe. Now, let's begin. The fog rolled in from the bay as it always did, thick and cold, wrapping itself around the gas lamps of Market Street like a living shroud. Dr. Thomas Whitmore pulled his coat tighter as he hurried through the September evening, his medical bag heavy in his hand. The summons had come an hour ago, urgent, the messenger had said. Another victim. That made 7 in 3 weeks. The address led him to a tenement house near the waterfront, where the smell of fish and rotting wood hung perpetually in the air. A crowd had gathered outside, their faces pale in the lamplight. Voices hushed. They parted for him as he approached, their eyes following him with a mixture of hope and dread. "Third floor, doctor," a woman whispered, crossing herself. "God help us all." Thomas climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The building was barely 10 years old, thrown up hastily after the great fires, but it already seemed ancient, sagging under the weight of too many lives crammed into too little space. At the third-floor landing, a policeman stood guard, his face greenish in the dim light. "Officer Brennan," Thomas said, recognizing the young man from previous calls. "Dr. Whitmore." Brennan's voice was unsteady. "I've seen some things in my time on the force, but this ain't natural, doctor." Thomas had heard variations of this statement at each of the previous scenes. He steeled himself and entered the room. The smell hit him first, a sickly sweet odor that reminded him of overripe fruit left too long in the sun. The room was small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, the washstand, and the single chair. On the bed lay what remained of Marcus Chen, a laundryman whose shop stood 2 blocks away. At first glance, it appeared that Chen had been savagely beaten. His face and hands were swollen beyond recognition, the skin stretched tight and discolored purple, black, and an angry red. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen this before, 6 times now. He approached the body slowly, his medical instincts warring with his revulsion. Chen's mouth was open in a silent scream, his tongue grotesquely enlarged. Thomas gently turned the dead man's head, noting the hundreds, no, thousands, of small puncture wounds that covered every inch of exposed skin. They were precise, almost surgical in their regularity. "Stings," Thomas murmured, "just like the others." "What kind of creature does this?" Brennan asked from the doorway, unwilling to come closer. Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he carefully examined the room. The window was closed, latched from the inside. No visible insects. No nest. Nothing to indicate how such an attack could have occurred. Yet the evidence was undeniable. He'd first thought it was some exotic species of bee or wasp, perhaps brought in on one of the ships that crowded San Francisco's harbor. The city had grown so rapidly since the gold rush, becoming a great Pacific port, that all manner of foreign goods and creatures arrived daily. But he'd consulted with every naturalist and entomologist he could find, even sending telegrams to experts in New York and Washington. None had heard of any insect capable of such coordinated, deadly assault. "When was he found?" Thomas asked. "About 2 hours ago. His wife came home from the market and, well, you can imagine." Thomas could. He'd had to console 6 other families in the past 3 weeks. What could he tell them? That their loved ones had been stung to death by insects that left no trace? That there was no defense, no warning? He took samples of the tissue around several of the sting sites, carefully placing them in glass vials. Perhaps a proper laboratory analysis would reveal something he'd missed. As he worked, he became aware of a sound, soft, almost musical, a humming. "Do you hear that?" he asked Brennan. The officer tilted his head, listening. "I don't hear nothing, Doctor." But Thomas heard it clearly now, a low vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He placed his palm against the plaster and felt it a subtle trembling, rhythmic and constant. His blood ran cold. "We need to evacuate this building," he said quietly. "What? Why?" "Now, officer. Get everyone out. Now." Something in Thomas's tone must have convinced Brennan, because the young policeman turned and began shouting orders. Thomas grabbed his bag and followed, but not before casting one last look at Marcus Chen. In the dim light, he thought he saw something moving in the dead man's hair, a dark shape no bigger than his thumb with translucent wings. By the time he reached the street, Brennan had roused the entire building. Families streamed out, carrying children, and hastily grabbed possessions, confused and frightened. Thomas stood across the street, watching the building's windows, waiting. He didn't have to wait long. It started as a dark smudge at one of the third-floor windows, a shadow that grew and spread. Then the glass shattered outward in a cascade of glittering fragments. And they came. Thousands upon thousands of them, pouring from the window like smoke, filling the air with their bodies and their sound. That same low, ominous humming that now rose to a roar. People screamed and scattered. Thomas stood frozen, transfixed by the sight. They were bees, or something very much like bees, but larger than any he'd seen, each one the size of his thumb, their bodies black and gleaming in the lamplight. They moved with terrible purpose, swirling in a great cloud that seemed to pulse and breathe as a single organism. And then, as quickly as they'd emerged, they dispersed, vanishing into the fog and the night, their humming fading to nothing. Thomas found Brennan crouched behind a wagon, his face white as chalk. "What in God's name was that?" the officer whispered. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I intend to find out." The next morning, Thomas sat in the office of Dr. Harold Vestry, San Francisco's chief health officer. Vestry was a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and a perpetually skeptical expression. He listened to Thomas's account with increasing incredulity. "Flying insects?" Vestry said when Thomas had finished. "You're suggesting that we have some sort of killer bees terrorizing the city?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Harold. I'm telling you what I've observed. 7 people dead in 3 weeks, all exhibiting the same symptoms. Thousands of sting marks, massive envenomation, death by anaphylactic shock, and respiratory failure. It's preposterous. If such creatures existed, we'd have reports from elsewhere. There would be precedent." "Perhaps we're the precedent," Thomas said. "Perhaps something has changed. The city is growing so rapidly, Harold. We're building over marshlands, disturbing habitats, bringing in materials from all over the world. Maybe we've awakened something, or created the conditions for something new." Vestry leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "And what would you have me do? Issue a public warning? Tell the citizens of San Francisco to beware of killer bees? I'd be laughed out of office. The mayor would have my head. 7 people are dead. 7 people out of a population of 300,000. People die every day in this city, Thomas. Consumption, cholera, accidents, violence. We have real public health crises to manage. I can't divert resources to chase after phantom insects based on your intuition." Thomas stood, anger flaring in his chest. "They're not phantoms, Harold. I saw them. Brennan saw them. Half a tenement building saw them. What they saw was a swarm of ordinary bees, probably disturbed from a nest somewhere in the walls. It's tragic that Mr. Chen died, but the connection you're drawing is speculative at best. And if I'm right, if there's an 8th victim, a 9th?" Vestry's expression hardened. "Then you'll bring me concrete evidence, not wild theories. Until then, I suggest you focus on your regular practice. Good day, Dr. Whitmore." Thomas left the office seething with frustration, but Vestry's dismissal only strengthened his resolve. If the city's health department wouldn't act, he would investigate on his own. Over the following days, Thomas mapped the locations of the attacks. All 7 victims had lived or worked within a 3-block radius of the waterfront, in an area where several new buildings had been constructed in the past year. He interviewed neighbors, searching for any common thread. What he found was a pattern of strange occurrences preceding each attack. Residents reported unusual humming sounds coming from walls or basements. Several mentioned finding dead birds or rats, their bodies covered in what looked like sting marks. One old Chinese woman told him through a translator about seeing ghost bees that glowed faintly in the dark, a detail Thomas might have dismissed as superstition if not for everything else he'd witnessed. His investigation led him to a construction site on Battery Street, where a new office building was rising from the ruins of an old warehouse. According to his research, this warehouse had been the site of a mysterious fire 2 months ago, just before the first attack. Thomas arrived at the site after dark, when the workers had gone home. The moon was half full, providing just enough light to see by. The building was a skeleton of wood and steel, its upper floors still open to the sky. He made his way through the ground floor, stepping carefully over debris and discarded tools. The humming started when he descended to the basement. It was unmistakable now, that low vibration that he'd felt in Marcus Chen's room. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that he felt in his bones as much as heard with his ears. Thomas lit a lantern and raised it high, peering into the darkness. The basement had been partially excavated, the earth floor dug out to create more headroom. In the far corner, near what had been the foundation of the old warehouse, he saw it, a structure that defied easy description. It was a hive, but unlike any he'd ever seen or read about. It rose from the floor nearly to the ceiling, perhaps 12 feet tall, and it glowed with a faint, phosphorescent light, the same ghostly luminescence the old woman had described. Its surface was smooth and organic, like wax, but it seemed to pulse rhythmically, as if breathing. Channels and passages covered its surface, and he could see movement within, dark shapes crawling and writhing. Thomas approached slowly, barely daring to breathe. The humming grew louder with each step, and he felt the air grow warmer, thick with a sweet, cloying scent. As he drew close enough for the lantern light to fully illuminate the structure, he saw them clearly for the first time. They were bees, but changed, evolved into something monstrous. Each was easily 3 inches long, with bodies that gleamed like polished obsidian. Their wings were nearly transparent, shot through with veins that pulsed with the same eerie light as the hive. And their eyes, compound eyes that should have been blank and insectile, seemed to watch him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. One of them detached from the hive and hovered before him at eye level. Thomas froze, his heart hammering. The creature drifted closer, its wings creating a miniature windstorm that made his lantern flicker. It tilted its head, a disturbingly mammalian gesture, and then returned to the hive. Thomas backed away slowly, his mind reeling. This was no ordinary nest. This was something else entirely, something that couldn't exist according to everything he knew about the natural world. Yet here it was, growing in the basement of a building in the heart of San Francisco. He needed help. He needed experts, equipment, perhaps even the army. But as he turned to leave, he realized with growing horror that he'd made a terrible mistake. The way out was blocked. They poured from the hive in a living wave, hundreds of them, their wings creating a roar that drowned out all thought. Thomas stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. The glass shattered, and flames leaped up, catching on the dry wood scattered across the floor. The bees reacted immediately to the fire, their humming rising to a shriek. They swarmed toward Thomas, and he felt the first stings pierce his hands, his face. The pain was extraordinary, not just the sharp jab of the sting, but a burning that seemed to spread through his veins like liquid fire. He ran, crashing through the flames, feeling more stings strike his neck, his back. The stairs were ahead, and he took them 3 at a time, bursting out into the ground floor with the swarm close behind. Behind him, he could hear the fire spreading, crackling hungrily through the dry timbers. Thomas made it outside and collapsed on the street, gasping for air. His hands were already swelling, his vision beginning to blur. But he was alive. and the swarm hadn't followed him out. Perhaps the smoke and flames had driven them back. Or perhaps a chilling thought they'd learned to use him as a warning, to let him escape so he could spread fear of their power. Through his fading consciousness, he heard shouts, saw figures running toward him. The fire alarm bells began to ring out across the city. The construction site was fully ablaze now, flames shooting high into the night sky. As darkness claimed him, Thomas's last coherent thought was that the fire might solve the problem. The hive would burn, the creatures would die, and the nightmare would end. He was wrong. Thomas woke 3 days later in Street. Mary's hospital, his body wrapped in bandages, his throat too swollen to speak. A nurse brought him water and told him that he'd suffered severe stinging reactions but would recover. The fire on Battery Street had burned for hours before the volunteer brigades brought it under control. The building was a total loss. But the attacks hadn't stopped. While Thomas lay in his hospital bed, 3 more people had died. A dock worker, a seamstress, and a banker. All showed the same symptoms. All had been found in buildings within the same neighborhood. When Thomas was finally able to speak, he insisted on seeing Officer Brennan. The young policeman arrived that afternoon, looking haggard and frightened. "It's spreading, Doctor," Brennan said without preamble. "We've had reports from 4 more buildings. People hearing sounds in the walls, seeing the creatures. The mayor's called in the state militia. But what are they going to do? Shoot at bees? The fire," Thomas croaked. "Did it destroy the hive?" Brennan's expression answered the question before he spoke. "We sent men down into the basement once it cooled enough." "The hive was gone, Doctor, but they found tunnels. Dozens of them, burrowed into the earth, heading off in every direction. Whatever was down there, it had already spread throughout the neighborhood. Maybe farther." Thomas closed his eyes, a cold dread settling over him. They weren't dealing with a single hive. They were dealing with a network, a vast underground system that had grown beneath the city like a cancer, unseen and unstoppable. "There's more," Brennan continued. "We've been trying to keep it quiet, but people are starting to panic. Some families are packing up and leaving the city altogether. There's talk in the newspapers of a plague, of divine judgment. The mayor's office is denying everything, but that just makes it worse." "How many now?" Thomas asked. "How many dead?" 14. And that's just the ones we know about. There could be more in the Chinese Quarter. You know, they don't always report to the authorities." Thomas struggled to sit up, ignoring the pain that shot through his swollen limbs. "We need to find the source. The original nest. There must be a queen, a central hive that's spawning the others. The original," and quote, "the original warehouse," Brennan said. "Before it burned down 2 months ago, what was it used for? I don't know. I didn't think to research its history before the fire." "I did." Brennan pulled out a small notebook. "It was an import warehouse, mainly goods from China and the Pacific Islands. But here's what's interesting. In the weeks before the fire, there were complaints about strange smells coming from the building. The owner dismissed them, but several workers reported feeling sick, dizzy. One man swore he saw ghosts moving in the walls. What caused the fire? Officially, unknown. But I talked to one of the fire brigade captains off the record. He said the fire was already out of control when they arrived, and it burned hotter than it should have. Almost like something was feeding it, making it spread faster." Thomas felt the pieces clicking into place. "The warehouse owner, is he still alive?" "That's the thing, Doctor. He was the first victim. Found dead in his home 4 weeks ago, covered in sting marks. We didn't connect it to the warehouse at the time. They killed him," Thomas said softly. "They destroyed their original hive, killed the man who kept them confined, and then spread throughout the city." He looked at Brennan. "Don't you see? They're not just acting on instinct. They're thinking, planning. This is calculated." Brennan stared at him. "You're saying these things are intelligent?" "I'm saying we're not dealing with ordinary insects. I saw them, Brennan. I looked into their eyes. There was something there, something that recognized me, assessed me as a threat or a resource." The policeman was quiet for a long moment. Finally, He said, "If you're right, doctor, if these things are smart and they're spreading, then we're not dealing with an infestation. We're dealing with an invasion." Against his doctor's protests, Thomas discharged himself from the hospital the next day. His hands were still swollen, his face marked with dozens of angry red welts. But he could move, and that was enough. There was work to be done. He met with Brennan and a small group of others who'd witnessed the attacks or lost loved ones to them, a coalition born of desperation and grief. They gathered in a church basement, speaking in hushed tones, sharing information that the authorities were ignoring or suppressing. Margaret Holloway, whose husband had been the second victim, had been keeping detailed records. She spread maps across a table, marking each attack site with a pin. "Look at the pattern," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "They're radiating outward from the waterfront in a spiral. Each new nest is approximately 3 blocks from the last. At this rate, they'll cover the entire city in a matter of months." "We have to burn them out," said James Chen, Marcus's brother. "Fire is the only thing they fear." "Fire is what spread them in the first place," Thomas countered. "When we burned the construction site, they'd already escaped through tunnels. We'd just be destroying buildings while they moved to new locations." "Then what do we do?" Margaret asked. "Wait for them to kill us all?" Thomas had been thinking about this question for days. We need to understand them first. Where did they come from? What do they want? And most importantly, how do they communicate? "What does it matter where they came from?" James demanded. "They're here, they're killing people." "It matters because it might tell us how to stop them." Thomas pulled out his own notes, sketches he'd made of the hive and the creatures. "I believe these organisms were brought to San Francisco in some cargo shipment, probably from somewhere in the Pacific. They've adapted to our environment, possibly mutated in response to something in the warehouse chemicals, heat, who knows. But their behavior suggests more than instinct. They're organized, strategic. There must be some form of collective intelligence guiding." "Like a hive mind?" Brennan said. "Precisely. And if there's a hive mind, there might be a way to disrupt it." Over the following week, their group grew. A chemist named Edward Walsh joined them, bringing expertise in poisons and fumigants. A naturalist, Miss Charlotte Reeves, contributed her knowledge of insect behavior. Even a few militia members came, tired of taking orders that accomplished nothing. They began a systematic study of the creatures, collecting specimens from the buildings where they'd been sighted. The bees proved extremely difficult to capture. They seemed to sense when they were being hunted and would vanish into hidden crevices. But eventually, through careful planning and coordination, they managed to trap several in glass jars. The specimens revealed disturbing details. Under magnification, Charlotte observed that the bees' bodies showed evidence of rapid evolution vestigial structures that suggested they'd changed dramatically in a very short time. Their stingers, rather than the simple barbed spikes of normal bees, were complex injection mechanisms capable of delivering significantly more venom. "Look at this," Charlotte said, pointing to a specimen under her microscope. "See these structures along the thorax? They look almost like receptors. Organs designed to detect vibrations or chemical signals. Communication organs," Thomas said. "Possibly. But if so, they're far more sophisticated than anything I've seen in nature. It's as if these creatures have been engineered." Edward Walsh's chemical analysis of the venom proved equally unsettling. "It's not just venom," he reported. "There are neurotoxic compounds here that I can't identify. Some of them seem designed specifically to affect human nervous systems. Others appear to break down tissue at an accelerated rate, almost as if—" He paused, his expression troubled. "As if what?" Thomas prompted. "As if the venom is meant to prepare the victim for consumption. Doctor, I think these creatures are feeding on their victims. Not immediately, but after death. The venom predigests the tissue." The room fell silent. Margaret Holloway spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband's body. They wouldn't let me see it before the funeral. Said it was too disturbed. But I insisted on an open casket, and even after the undertaker's work, he looked diminished. I thought it was the swelling going down, but Thomas felt sick. If Walsh was right, then the attacks weren't defensive. They were hunting. The bees were hunting humans for food. The 19th victim died on a Tuesday evening, screaming so loudly that half the neighborhood heard her. By the time help arrived, she was already gone, her body covered in thousands of sting marks, her features unrecognizable. But this attack was different. This victim was wealthy, a woman from Nob Hill whose husband had connections to the governor. Her death couldn't be suppressed or explained away. By Wednesday morning, the story was on the front page of every newspaper in the city. Killer bees claim society matron, read the Chronicle's headline. The call went further. Plague of biblical proportions descends on San Francisco. Panic spread faster than the bees themselves. Businesses closed, schools emptied. The ferries to Oakland ran day and night, carrying families fleeing the city. The militia set up checkpoints, but they had no idea what they were trying to contain. How do you blockade against insects? Thomas's group met that evening in an emergency session. The situation had escalated beyond anything they could handle alone, but they were still the only ones who'd made any real progress in understanding the threat. "We need to find the queen," Thomas said. "Or whatever serves as the central intelligence for the hive. Cut off the head, and maybe the body will die." "How?" Charlotte asked. "We don't even know if there is a queen. Traditional beehives have queens, yes, but these things don't follow traditional patterns." "The tunnels," Brennan said. "We need to map the tunnels, follow them to their source." "That could take months," James protested. "We don't have months." Thomas thought back to his encounter in the basement, to the way the creatures had reacted to his presence. They'd been protective of the hive, but they'd also been curious, studying him, and they'd let him go. "What if we don't need to find them?" he said slowly. "What if we let them find us?" "Explain," Edward said. "They're intelligent. They study their prey. What if we give them a target they can't resist? What if we draw them out?" The plan that emerged was desperate and dangerous, but it was all they had. They would create a lure, a false hive built with materials that mimicked the pheromones and vibrations of the real hives. They'd set it up in an abandoned building on the waterfront, wired with explosives. When the bees came to investigate, they'd detonate the charges, collapsing the building, and, hopefully, burying a significant portion of the swarm. It wouldn't destroy them all, but it might buy the city time to evacuate or organize a more comprehensive defense. They worked through the night, preparing their trap. Edward synthesized compounds based on samples they'd collected. Charlotte designed the structure to mimic the appearance and sound of a real hive. The militia provided the explosives, unofficial support that could be denied if the plan went wrong. By dawn, everything was ready. The false hive sat in the center of the old waterfront warehouse, pulsing with artificial light, humming with mechanically generated vibrations. Thomas and the others retreated to a safe distance, watching through binoculars, waiting. They didn't have to wait long. The bees came at mid-morning, appearing first as a dark smudge on the horizon, growing rapidly into a massive swarm. They poured through the warehouse's broken windows, thousands upon thousands of them, their collective drone audible even from blocks away. Thomas watched through his binoculars, his heart pounding. The swarm circled the false hive, investigating it from all angles. For a terrible moment, he thought they'd recognize the deception and would leave. But then they began to land on it, crawling over its surface, their bodies clustered so thickly that the structure disappeared beneath them. "Now," Thomas whispered. Brennan pressed the detonator. The explosion was massive, far larger than Thomas had anticipated. The entire warehouse erupted in a ball of flame and flying debris. The sound of it rolled across the city like thunder, shaking windows blocks away. A pillar of smoke and fire rose into the morning sky. Through the chaos, Thomas saw something that turned his blood to ice. The bees were leaving the explosion, streaming out in organized columns, but they weren't fleeing in panic. They moved with purpose, in formation, and they were heading directly toward Thomas and the others. "Run!" he shouted, but it was already too late. The swarm descended on them like a black wave. Thomas felt stings piercing his arms, his neck, his face. He heard screams around him, Charlotte, Edward, James, others whose names he didn't know. He ran blindly, swinging his arms, feeling the creatures bouncing off him, stinging again and again. He made it perhaps 20 feet before his legs gave out. The venom was already taking effect, his muscles spasming, his throat closing. He collapsed on the cobblestones, vision dimming, the sound of the swarm filling his ears. This is how it ends, he thought. We tried, and we failed, and now we'll feed them just like all the others. But death didn't come. The stinging stopped. Through his swollen eyelids, Thomas saw the swarm hovering above him, a living cloud of black bodies. They weren't attacking anymore. They were waiting. And then he heard it, a sound beneath their humming, a pattern in the chaos. It was almost like language, like words formed from vibrations and wing beats. He couldn't understand it, not with his conscious mind, but some deeper part of him recognized it as communication. They were trying to tell him something. The swarm parted, creating a corridor, and through it came a single bee. But this one was different, larger than the others, nearly 6 inches long, its body marked with patterns that seemed to shift and move in the light. It landed on Thomas's chest, and he felt its weight pressing down on him. It stayed there for a long moment, and Thomas felt something pass between them. Not words, not images, but understanding. The bees weren't invaders. They weren't monsters. They were refugees, fleeing something far worse, something that had destroyed their original home and forced them to adapt, to change, to survive at any cost. And humanity, spreading across their new territory, building and burning and destroying, was the latest threat, their survival. The large bee lifted off, rejoining the swarm. Together, they rose into the sky and disappeared toward the east, leaving Thomas and his companions, alive but broken. Thomas recovered, slowly and painfully. So did most of the others, though Edward Walsh succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. The bee's message, if that's what it had been left, Thomas changed. He couldn't explain it to anyone else, couldn't make them understand what he'd felt in that moment of connection. The attacks stopped after that day. The bees remained in the city, their hives hidden in walls and basements and sewers, but they no longer killed. They'd made their point, established their territory. An uneasy truce settled over San Francisco. The newspapers reported that the plague had ended, attributing it to vigilant public health measures. The mayor claimed victory. Life returned to something resembling normal, though certain neighborhoods remained abandoned, ceded to the hives. Thomas continued his medical practice, but he also kept watching, studying, learning. He'd glimpsed something that shouldn't exist, touched the edge of an intelligence that humanity wasn't ready to acknowledge. The bees had come to San Francisco seeking survival, and they'd found it, no matter the cost. On foggy nights, when the gas lamps cast strange shadows and the city seemed wrapped in mystery, Thomas would sometimes hear that familiar humming, and he would remember the weight of the queen on his chest, the moment when 2 species looked at each other and recognized that neither would yield, that both would do whatever necessary to survive. The hive had come to San Francisco, and it was here to stay. The city belonged to more than just humans now, and Thomas wondered what would happen when the bees grew bolder, when their numbers increased, when the truce inevitably broke down. But those were worries for another day. For now, he had patients to tend, and a secret to keep, and the first stop 10. Memory of those black wings glittering in the smoke. The year was 1890, and San Francisco had changed forever. Something new had been born in its shadows. Something that blurred the line between natural and unnatural, between pest and predator. And Dr. Thomas Whitmore, who had looked into the hive's dark heart and lived to tell the tale, knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. So there you have it, the Hive of Market Street. Now, I want to know, would you have tried to destroy the hive like Dr. Whitmore, or would you have fled San Francisco at the first sign of trouble? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story gave you chills, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more tales from history's darkest corners. I've got dozens more stories waiting to be told, from haunted asylums to cursed ships to things that lurk in places they shouldn't. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the next time you hear buzzing in your walls, Maybe call an exterminator instead of investigating yourself. Sweet dreams, everyone.